grows weaker by the day.
There was a job in the English royal court that noblemen would literally kill for. Not a general, not a knight, not even an advisor to the king. No, this job involved wiping the king's butt and staring at his poop every single day. And you know what the craziest part is? People were desperate to get it. Subscribe to the channel to discover the side of history that the books don't tell you about. Today, I'm going to tell you the bizarre story of the Groom of the Stool, the most powerful position you've never heard of. A job so disgusting that it sounds like a punishment, but in reality, it was one of the most sought-after positions in all of England. We're talking about real power, real money, and access to the most important person in the entire kingdom. All you had to do was get comfortable with some really gross stuff. Let me set the scene for you. We're in England around the 1500s. King Henry VII is on the throne, and if you think life was all castles and fancy parties, think again. Life back then was brutal. If you weren't born rich, you were basically screwed. You worked until your body gave out, you ate whatever scraps you could find, and forget about climbing the social ladder. That thing was locked tight. But here's the thing about medieval society. Everything revolved around the king. And I mean everything. The king wasn't just a political leader, he was basically treated like a living god. Whatever he wanted, he got. Whoever he liked became powerful. Whoever he didn't like, well, they usually ended up losing their head. So if you were a nobleman trying to make it in the royal court, your entire strategy came down to one simple goal: get close to the king. The closer you were to him, the more influence you had. The more influence you had, the richer you became. Simple as that. But here's the problem. Everyone wanted to be close to the king. The competition was insane. You had lords, knights, advisors, all trying to kiss up to the king every single day. How do you stand out? How do you get the king's attention when there are hundreds of other people trying to do the exact same thing? Well, some genius figured it out. And his solution was absolutely disgusting. So here's what happened. Kings back then had servants for literally everything. Someone to dress them, someone to pour their wine, someone to carry their sword. But there was one very personal, very private moment where the king was completely vulnerable. When he had to use the bathroom. Now, you might think this would be a private affair, but remember, we're talking about medieval times. Privacy wasn't really a thing, especially for royalty. Everything about the king's life was public in some way, and someone had to help him with this particular task. Enter the Groom of the Stool. The official job description was simple. This person was responsible for helping the king go to the bathroom. That meant bringing the portable toilet, which was called a stool, staying with the king while he did his business, wiping him clean afterwards, and then inspecting what came out to make sure the king was healthy. Yeah, you heard that right. Inspecting the poop. I know what you're thinking. This sounds like the worst job in human history. Who in their right mind would want to do this? But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't some low-level servant doing this job. This was a position reserved for noblemen. Actual high-ranking members of the court were competing for the chance to wipe the king's butt. Why? Because of one simple fact. This job gave you completely private, uninterrupted access to the king. Think about it. Every other advisor, every other nobleman, they had to wait for an audience with the king. They had to compete for his attention during public events. They had to deal with other people listening to their conversations. But the Groom of the Stool, he got to spend time alone with the king multiple times a day. No one else around. Just him and the most powerful man in England. This was the ultimate opportunity to build a relationship. While the king was sitting there doing his business, the groom of the stool could talk to him about anything. Politics, gossip, personal advice, you name it. And the king, being in a vulnerable and relaxed state, was way more likely to actually listen and open up. Let me give you a real example. One of the most famous grooms of the stool was a guy named Hugh Danny. He served King Henry VII, and because of his position, he became one of the king's closest friends and most trusted advisors. The king gave him land, money, titles, everything. All because he had that private access. But it gets even better. When King Henry VIII came to power, he took this position to a whole new level. Henry VIII, if you don't know, was one of the most powerful and paranoid kings in English history. He was the guy who had 6 wives and executed 2 of them. He didn't trust anybody. But his groom of the stool? That person was in his inner circle. One of Henry VIII's grooms of the stool was a guy named Henry Norris. This man became so close to the king that he was basically his best friend. He got a knighthood, he got estates, he became one of the richest men in England. And all of this started because he was willing to do a job that everyone else thought was beneath them. Now, I need to explain something about medieval medicine because it actually makes this job even more important. Back then, doctors believed that you could tell everything about a person's health by looking at their poop. They thought different colors, textures, and smells meant different things. If the king's poop looked wrong, it could mean he was sick, poisoned, or cursed. So the groom of the stool wasn't just cleaning up. He was literally responsible for monitoring the king's health. If something seemed off, he would report it to the royal doctors. This made him an essential part of keeping the king alive, which obviously made him even more valuable. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Remember how I said this position gave you incredible power? Well, power in the royal court was a double-edged sword. The same access that made you rich and influential could also get you killed. Let me tell you what happened to Henry Norris, that groom of the stool I mentioned earlier. He was at the peak of his power, one of the king's closest friends, living in luxury. Then one day, King Henry VIII decided he wanted to get rid of his wife, Anne Boleyn. He needed an excuse, so he accused her of having affairs with multiple men at court. And guess who was on that list? Henry Norris. Now, there was zero evidence that Norris had done anything wrong. He was completely innocent. But the king had made up his mind, and when a paranoid king wants you gone, you're gone. Henry Norris was arrested, thrown in the Tower of London, and executed. Just like that, the most powerful servant in the kingdom lost everything, including his head. This is the risk that came with the job. You were so close to the king that if he ever turned on you, there was no escape. You knew too much. You had too much access. One wrong move, one moment of suspicion, and you were done. But despite this danger, people still fought for the position. Because if you played your cards right, the rewards were unbelievable. Let me tell you about another groom of the stool named Michael Henich. This guy served King Henry VIII later in his reign, and he did everything right. He kept his head down, he was loyal, he didn't get involved in court drama. And when Henry died, Henich walked away with a massive fortune and retired in peace. He's proof that if you were smart about it, this job could set you up for life. The position of groom of the stool continued for generations. It survived multiple kings, and the power that came with it only grew. By the time King Charles II was on the throne in the 1600s, the groom of the stool was essentially the chief of staff for the entire royal household. He controlled who got to see the king. He managed the king's money. He had influence over major political decisions. And yeah, He still technically had to help the king in the bathroom, but by this point, that was almost symbolic. The real job was being the king's right-hand man. Eventually, the position was renamed to Groom of the Stool, to make it sound less disgusting, and then it was quietly phased out entirely. But for hundreds of years, this bizarre, gross job was one of the most important positions in all of England. So why am I telling you all of this? Because this story reveals something fascinating about power and ambition. In a world where everyone is competing for the same thing, sometimes the winning move is to do what no one else is willing to do. Every nobleman in England wanted to be a general, a knight, an advisor. Those were the glamorous positions. But the smartest players realized that proximity to power is more valuable than the appearance of power. They were willing to swallow their pride, do the dirty work, and position themselves where it actually mattered. And here's the thing, this lesson still applies today. We live in a world where everyone wants the fancy title, the big office, the impressive job description, but the people who actually succeed are often the ones willing to start at the bottom, do the unglamorous work, and build real relationships with the people who matter. The Groom of the Stool understood something that most people miss. Access is everything. It doesn't matter how talented you are, or how good your ideas are, if you can't get in the room with the decision maker. And once you're in that room, once you have that person's trust, the opportunities are endless. So yeah, the Groom of the Stool was a real job, and it was absolutely as gross as it sounds. But it was also one of the smartest career moves you could make in medieval England. The men who held this position became some of the richest and most powerful people in the kingdom, all because they were willing to do something that everyone else found disgusting. It just goes to show that throughout history, the path to success has never been about doing what's easy or what looks good. It's about doing what works. And sometimes, what works is really, really weird. Next time you're grossed out by a job or an opportunity, remember the Groom of the Stool. Those guys literally wiped the king's butt and became legends because of it. If you want more insane stories from history, hit that subscribe button.